Today we're picking up with working for peace. Diplomacy is a huge part of our foreign policy in the United States. Diplomacy is the process of conducting relations between nations, between countries. So how we actually go about addressing issues in other countries. Personal diplomacy is something that the U.S. uses a lot, especially the president. Personal diplomacy is where he travels to other nations to meet with other nations' leaders. It's more of a personal touch on things. Typically, the president or other officials will meet in a summit. And a summit is a meeting among leaders of two or more nations in order to discuss issues that concern those nations. So it might be something like weapons control or pollution or trade or whatever it is. There are several different alliances that the U.S. is involved in. We are involved in the OAS, which is the Organization of American States. This involves the U.S. and most of the nations of Latin America. The goal of the OAS is a mutual defense alliance that we will help and protect each other, and a peaceful settlement of disputes among the member nation that we agree to negotiate rather than fight out our differences. Another alliance that the U.S. is involved in is ANZUS, ANZUS, which is Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And again, the goal for this is to provide mutual defense in case we are attacked. Another alliance is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which involves the U.S. and most of the Western European countries. The goal of this is to establish a united front against the threat of aggression by the Soviet Union. So NATO was created during the Cold War era. And it still exists today, even though the Soviet Union is gone. But they still are an alliance that is a defense alliance. An attack on one is considered to be an attack on all nations of NATO. Foreign aid is another way that we help to have diplomacy with other countries. Foreign aid is any government program that provides economic or military assistance to other nations. Usually it's money. The U.S. spends billions of dollars to help other nations, but sometimes it can include other things like the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is an organization that sends volunteers to countries that request assistance. So things in like teaching or engineering, agriculture, healthcare workers, that's what the Peace Corps is about. But it's a non-monetary way of helping out other countries. The final organization that the U.S. is involved in is the United Nations. Forming the United Nations happened after World War II. Representatives from 50 nations met together in San Francisco in 1945, and they formed the UN. The goal of the UN was to stress peaceful coexistence and cooperation among all the nations of the world, that we need to work better at getting along than fighting each other. Today, the organization has more than 180 permanent members, and its headquarters are in New York City. The organization of the UN, there are 6 main divisions of the UN. The first is the General Assembly, and the General Assembly is the body that debates, discusses, and recommends solutions for problems that come to the UN. Each member nation has 1 vote in the General Assembly, and they deal with issues that include things like world peace, adding new members, and budget issues. The Assembly meets annually, so it means that it meets once a year at least. The second part is the Security Council, and the Security Council is made up of 15 members, including 5 permanent members who are on there all the time. Those 5 permanent members are the U.S., Russia, Great Britain, France, and China. So those 5 are on all the time. The other 10 members are voted on and rotated in and out. The 10 temporary members are chosen by the Assembly for a 2-year term. All measures that come before the Council have to have 9 of the 15 votes in order to pass, so basically a majority. However, if one of the permanent members vetoes it, then it's automatically defeated. So if one of the 5 veto it, then it's automatic. It doesn't matter if there's a majority otherwise. Now, the Security Council's job is to help keep countries out of war. If countries are fighting, they are called before the Council to negotiate. If they refuse to negotiate, then the Council can take action, and typically they call on UN members to break off relations and not trade with those countries that are causing problems. And typically that is enough to make them come to the negotiating table. The third group, or the third part of it, is the International Court of Justice. It's also known as the World Court. It includes 15 judges from various nations, and each serves a 9-year term, and the decisions are made by a majority vote. They decide matters like boundary disputes and debt payments. The fourth part of the UN is the Economic and Social Council. The Economic and Social Council is made up of 54 representatives on the council. It is dedicated to improving the lives of the world's people. They conduct studies in health and human rights, education, world population, narcotic drugs, all kinds of stuff, and then they make a recommendation to the General Assembly on how to deal with these particular issues. The fifth group, or fifth part of it, is the Trusteeship Council. And the Trusteeship Council supervises the progress of trust territories. Trust territories were colonies that were not self-governing at the end of World War II, so the UN monitors them and helps them to become self-governing or independent. The Trusteeship Council meets once a year, and today there is only one trust territory remaining of the original 11, and that's a small island out in the Pacific. The sixth part of it is the Secretariat. The Secretariat manages the day-to-day activities of the UN. It employs more than 9,000 people, and the Secretary General is in charge of it. The Secretary General's job is to make an annual report to the General Assembly. They have a lot of political and administrative influence in the UN. They can also advise the Security Council, and they serve a 5-year term. So that is the UN and how it's made up. There are several other specialized agencies that help the U.S. in foreign policy. They include the World Health Organization, or WHO, and it helps to fight worldwide battle against diseases and the spread of diseases. The FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization, oh my goodness, try this again. Food and Agriculture Organization helps nations to grow more and better food for their people. It also deals with issues like reforestation, soil conservation, irrigation, and improved farming methods. UNESCO, UNESCO, or the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, helps to extend educational opportunities everywhere in the world. It helps to improve literacy, education in countries that are lacking, but it also helps to protect and develop individual cultures and ways of life. IBRD, or IBRD, is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It's also called the World Bank, and it makes loans and gives technical and economic advice to help nations to improve their economies. So the role of the United Nations within the U.S. foreign policy, many Americans are very critical of the United Nations. They believe that the U.S. provides so much of the operating costs of the UN, and that's something that should be shared amongst the world nations, the member nations. Also, they're very critical because many small nations can outvote the larger nations in the General Assembly, so they're not real happy about every nation getting one vote. And they are also not happy about the failure to create a UN army because that prevents a failure to create the UN army, which prevents the UN from ending military disputes. Typically, it's U.S. forces that are going, and not everybody has an equal participation in the army. A lot of it is U.S. soldiers that are going to it. However, there are also many Americans who are hopeful about the UN and its progress. They feel that it is the best hope that we have for world peace, and that the UN has frequently succeeded in leading fighting nations to the conference table to negotiate rather than fight. And many Americans are okay with the fact that the UN does not have its own army, because if it did, it would have such a large force that would not be under American control, and that would be kind of a problem for us. We would have some issues with that.